communicating the details to others. And that's why I'm especially interested to hear more about the information sharing aspect of the NIS2 directive. But I have also some challenging questions, hopefully, if we have time. But before we go into more details, I want to introduce you to the member of the European Parliament, Bart Groothuis from the Netherlands. He is the rapporteur of the NIS2 directive, and he will answer all my questions. So welcome, Mr. Groothuis. Thank you so much for your time. And maybe you could briefly start describing.
He's offline. I can't see anything.
That's concerning, maybe. Well, okay.
We'll report it responsibly.
Okay.
What was your question?
So let me start with a hopefully easy question that apparently somebody doesn't want you to answer. What even is NIS2? Can you briefly describe the scope and why it is important?
Well, it's Europe's flagship on cybersecurity regulations and laws. And it's the successor of NIS1, which was the first time that Europe tried to do something over all member states to regulate cybersecurity. Many member states were extremely reluctant and they didn't want to. But it's like planting a flag, like colonizing America. This is my land, and now I have something to say, and from there you build. And this is what Europe sometimes does. And I think on cybersecurity, it's very wise. The basic of it all is the internal market. So if you do business, you have, I don't know, manufacturing companies in Romania, the Netherlands, Germany, and Italy. You're being treated the same, which is very nice. And so we've created better regulations for cybersecurity, that entities especially should protect themselves better. As we spend 41%, Fabian, 41% less than our American colleagues. And this is like, it's a waterbed effect. Hackers go where the resilience is least. And Europe is being hit harder than many other continents. And that's what we were worried about. So we created the NIS2.
So you already mentioned that it's about I'm so
entities.
Sorry. Okay. I have to apologize. I'm extremely nervous because I've never done this something like this before. I'm a nerdy hacker sitting in my dark room usually, so I'm getting a bit stumbled here. But when reading the introduction of the NIS directive, one of the first words and what is apparently the driving factor behind it is that it's to improve the cybersecurity capabilities within Europe. And I've been wondering, what even are the cybersecurity capabilities? You also mentioned that the member countries were quite reluctant to adopt NIS.
Yeah.
So what is it? Cybersecurity capabilities seem reasonable to implement. What are they reluctant about?
Well, they're reluctant about cybersecurity. Like I say, it's a member state competence, a national competence. We will deal with it ourselves. That's what member states said. But now they see, if we share information better and we can create an ecosystem, for example, for indicators of compromise after, during an attack, even before an attack, that's interesting. So we try to make a new legal basis to share information. And if you ask me, Fabian, I come from the cybersecurity community just like you. And when I became legislator, I thought, what is my raison d'être in good German, right? Why do I get up? And I get up to make the cybersecurity community feel like this is going better. And one of the things that we saw is it was hampered. Like the sharing of information was hampered by the GDPR. Right? Many people felt there could be reluctancy because there might be personal data in an email address, an IP address. Can you share that with others? It might help somebody else, but I might get a fine for it as well. That's what we try to decide. We set the record straight. You have a responsibility to share information. And it's not just about passively sharing data. It's about actively. So this is the second phase, the NIS2, of Europe's cybersecurity consciousness, the awareness of consciousness, not just passively sharing information after an incident, but even before incidents occur, doing something about it. We want eventually this ecosystem to be the basis of protective DNS, for example. Why don't we flag malware domains and make people aware that if you click on this false email, you get a red screen saying, this might be something you don't want. This is probably malware. It's a free country. Click if you want, but this is not the way that you want to be served. You're being fooled. And this is something we could actually do something actively. Protective DNS, warning initial ransomware victims. This is something that we really want.
As you mentioned, the sharing of incidents is very important and integral to this directive. And I've been, actually, it sounds like maybe a dumb question, but what even is a cybersecurity incident? Do you have some examples of what that could be?
Well, if you want to legally define that, that's very difficult. So we tried. We tried to define that in a significant incident, meaning it has significant effects on the, in a sense, essential services that an entity provides. That's difficult legal. Let me rephrase that for anyone that can follow. We used to have vital entities, vital infrastructure. It was water, energy, telecom. That's it. Now we are creating more than 160,000 entities across Europe. Also hospitals, great manufacturers, large companies, but also banking and financial sectors. And why the philosophy? The philosophy behind it is because those offer essential services to our citizens. That's very different than before. And it's very aligned with the business model of hackers, right? If you have a Russian ransomware group, they don't watch, is it water, is it telco, or is it energy? No, then we won't touch it. They touch whatever they think can benefit them. And the number of incidents, significant incidents in Europe in 2019 in my home country doubled. In the Netherlands. The FBI reported on 2020 that the number of ransomware incidents, significant incidents, tripled in 2020. That number has grown in 2021, etc. So we have a problem, and what we do now is entities, not just the critical vital infrastructure from the old days, but also new vital infrastructure like hospitals to protect themselves better.
Yeah. According to the NIS2 briefing, quoting some numbers, it was that according to Verizon, 86% of the breaches were financially motivated, while only 10% were espionage. You mentioned ransomware, which is a typical cybercrime operation with financial motivation. Do you think NIS is able to capture the cybercrime world as well as the espionage? Do you see a certain focus where NIS is helping?
Well, let's start with the high end, right? With nation-state actors, with advanced actors coming at you. And it's always a question of how much time and effort would someone put in to get in. And if you're a nation-state and you have a significant amount of resources, eventually they might get very far, but you can heighten the cost for them, for average businesses, or for those businesses you really want to protect. And what we've tried to do is make a risk-based approach that we would say, well, some manufacturers are in the scope, say your vital infrastructure now. But if you produce cookies, I don't mean the cookies you look after, but I mean cookies you can eat, for example, you don't have that high risk profile as you are probably ASML, right, in the Netherlands. That's a nation-state magnet, a hive where the Chinese would go and hunt whatever they can get their hands on. It's fine, and they will do everything. So what we try to do is heighten the barrier and do something about it. The second thing I'd like to say is, if you look at ransomware and the nature of ransomware and nation-state attacks, they've merged in the past years. What we see, many Russian-speaking, Russian-based ideologists and main CEOs behind our Russian ransomware attacks are also an instrument of the Kremlin as a foreign policy instrument, weakening the societal, but especially the economic fabric and structure of Europe is actually something the Kremlin wants to achieve in its foreign policy goals. It's melting together. And if you would look at, for example, colonial pipelines, maybe we can remember in the east coast of the Americas, the United States, a large pipeline was damaged by a ransomware attack. It couldn't deliver gasoline, and the prices went up very quick. If you would look at the ransomware, and I do that just like you, and if you look at it, if you decompile the code, it wouldn't have gone live if a Russian keyboard was attached, or it would have Russian time meetings. So it wasn't meant for Russian-speaking audiences. It's meant to weaken the West. This is exactly how technical artifacts lead to this assessment. And that's what we tried to legislate as well.
Yeah, you mentioned risk as a core word. Even if you search in a directive for the word risk, it appears over 100 of times. So risk management is a core principle, as it seems in this directive. And if we look at, quoting again the data in the briefing, it says that 45 of breaches featured hacking, while 17% involved malware and 22% involved phishing or other means. It shows that hacking with real vulnerability, so to say, is the minority. The majority is a human factor, and a human factor, that's a risk factor. So I was wondering, like, how does NIST handle the difference between vulnerabilities that can actually be discovered and be fixed, and this human factor, which is and will probably always be inherently risky to some degree?
What you say, inherently risky, is good to recognize. If I'm very critical, Fabian, let me cri de coeur. Not much of what we do around the world on cybersecurity is actually data-driven, right? We don't have the right data to say how preventive measures to mitigate the weakness of us humans and training, etc., and preventive measures, how that helps to mitigate cyber threats. I sometimes click on phishing emails, and I'm trained. I do it. And that's why I think you have to solve it technically. So this law does not. It's probably good to do something about prevention and awareness training, but I'm not saying it's wrong. But what I'm saying is you should do something technically to prevent people from infecting their machines by clicking on wrong emails. It's much more effective. And that data-drivenness, that I want to see more in future legislation. And I think that national cybersecurity centers have a big responsibility there. The CSIRTs, like we call them, need to gather that data, and we need to be more data-driven as we make policy in cybersecurity. If you look at the NCSC UK, they've said the same. We're all looking for the same data. What is actually working, what is not?
You mentioned a data-driven approach, and having read a little bit over the NIST directive, it's important that companies need to report on incidents.
Yeah.
I feel like this kind of data that is then collected, better understanding the threat landscape and the kind of incidents that appear, might also help us to identify what are even the critical systems, softwares, and products that are being targeted. Have you ever thought about using this kind of data collected in somewhat kind of like a European bug bounty? I imagine like a list published by Europe. These are the critical infrastructures, and we have a budget assigned, and we allow hackers like me to freely look for vulnerabilities reported and so forth?
Well, I thought about it a lot, Fabian, but there wasn't a majority to do something about it yet. But like I said, we planted a flag. Now we see what we can do more. But if you look, for example, in the UK, there's a government program, an active cyber defense program, running agents on the majority of the government computers and their top sectors, their top economic sectors. And what they do, those agents can identify what software is on every platform. So whenever you have a critical vulnerability somewhere, you can identify where is that software, and in which parts of the essential and vital critical infrastructure that we have is that. That's something that the majority of the countries does not yet have. Would I like to see that? Yes, in future, that's definitely something we would have to work on, sure. But the same goes for example, another innovation is telemetry and logging on our critical infrastructure, on our telecom, but also energy, water, and really critical infrastructure is mainly operated by cybersecurity companies from abroad. They at least have to share a carbon copy of their telemetry and logging to the national cybersecurity centers. And why? Because it's our own sovereign space. We want to know what is happening there. And also for bounty hunters and also for the programs that you mentioned, I think it has to be done inside. It's sovereign space. But if you look at the critical vulnerability, the vulnerability disclosure program that is in the NIS2, I think you should be very happy. It's done very responsible. We engage with stakeholders, with companies. The aim is to create a safer internet as such, and not think of the particular interest of a company, a hacker, or what you have. We want to have a safer internet.
You already mentioned the responsible disclosure, working together with the companies. I didn't find any guardrails that would in some way also protect me as a researcher. For example, what if a company does not want to disclose publicly this information? Are the reports that companies have to share about incidents public at some point by default? Is there a timeline for when the public will know, or is this only data that is internally getting used by Europe?
Well, it's a good question. And let me first say something about your first sentence. What we actually did is make sure that we did include it in a recital. Let's say, to say, what does an article mean? It means that hackers like you who found vulnerabilities, they can't be incriminated by the national courts. That's not the meaning. They should have leeway. They should have leeway to do their job in a free manner and report those vulnerabilities responsibly. And then, indeed, the manufacturers and the software and hardware developers, they have a responsibility to disclose that in a certain timeline. It is in there, and what we've tried to do is set it up so that everyone has the time and the review to have the patches available whenever anything comes out, like this is a new vulnerability, so that hackers can't exploit it that easily. That is the way that we want to go forward.
There are also reporting requirements. Yeah. I read that if a company is not fulfilling their due diligence, they could be fined. It might also make the managers responsible for that. Maybe you remember the SolarWinds incidents, where we just heard news about it last week in the US, where the SEC fined the CISO for allegedly lying about the security posture. Do you think NIS2 can prevent something like this happening in the EU?
Yeah, well, the first thing is the fine. Let me first say something about that. The fine, we said, if you don't have a fine, we've been discussing this for 15 years in Europe. And we said cybersecurity has to be a board issue of every essential critical entity and of every company. It hasn't. No one has succeeded in making it a board issue. Now, for the first time, like Commissioner Breton has said, when we created this legislation, the French commissioner, he put forward this proposal. He said it has to have teeth. If a tiger doesn't bite, if it doesn't have teeth, the legislation is not that valuable. So we put a personal liability to a CEO, and a liability from 1.4 to 2% of the yearly revenue. And why that number? Because that's exactly what ransomware gangs from Russia ask when they hack you. So you have a choice. I either pay to those Russian ransomware criminals, I either pay a fine, I'll tell you more about it, or I invest a little bit in cybersecurity and I'm much safer. Now, on that fine, that's not like if you would have a mistake like in SolarWinds that you could be fined in Europe. It's unthinkable. Right? Unthinkable. What we can do is with oversight bodies be in a conversation and then have a conversation about, are you doing enough? And that is very different. If you have negligence and it's demonstrably not taken on board, then someone can fine you. But that's a long process. Something that with SolarWinds, whatever you can say, they had EAL criteria, common criteria, certified. I wouldn't say that was the case. In Europe, that would be unthinkable. What is thinkable if you say, I don't care about European NIS2, I don't care about my cybersecurity, and you have warning after warning, you will get fined.
Okay, so do I have, as an individual, to worry about it? At what scale is this something to see?
It's only the CEO. There was in previous versions there was also the cybersecurity manager, and I said that's not reasonable. What I do think what will happen, Fabian, is that CEOs would say, "Really, am I be liable for another thing? I'll look for an insurance company to insure that." And what insurance companies do, they would hire people like you and others we know from the cybersecurity community, and you know what? They would come in and say, these are crown jewels. You want to segment this from that. You don't want a connection between this and that. You want to do this with password management, two-factor. So that's an extra bonus on your security. And I like that. I like that movement. So that might extra enhance our security as a whole.
An issue that I personally have, just based on my experience with finding security issues in client software, is that I find unique vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
The vulnerabilities I find are very difficult to avoid for a company through regulatory means, I would say, because they are just mistakes that happen during development. How can even the companies deal with that, and are they legible? No, what's the word?
Yeah,
are they eligible for fines if
liable.
they have liable? That's the word. Thank you. For mistakes in their code. What is the due diligence around that?
Well, no, and then let me then make it a little bit complicated. We have two major forms of legislation in Europe. The first is the NIS2 for entities. The second is the Cyber Resilience Act, which is for products like hard and software products. Both have their own logic and cybersecurity, also in coordinated vulnerability disclosure. But if you, for example, in a vital entity would have, I don't know, Microsoft Exchange, then what the entity is required to do is report that to the CSIRT and report it together to Microsoft so that it can be patched, right? We know that process. In the Cyber Resilience Act is different. There's a responsibility for producers of hard and software to create good software. And if vulnerabilities are found, then immediately with the creator of that software is in a process, and that's different. The critical entities have nothing to do with that. So there's two processes, but what we try to do is align them. It's getting complicated, right? It's getting complicated, but you know, this is the reality, and we're trying to streamline it as good as we can. But we want to make sure that all vulnerabilities found here are being reported in a responsible manner, not like in China. Because as you know, the Chinese vulnerabilities researchers are not allowed anymore to go to European contests. They are not allowed to report it to Microsoft. They should report it first to the Chinese services. And this is what worries me most. They are stockpiling 0 days, stockpiling unknown vulnerabilities with which they can hack into products and essentially in entities. And this is something that I'm worried about most, because this is something that we cannot really guard ourselves. Our resilience is always too low if you don't know with what they will hack you, and it will be effective anyway. The only thing that we can do is ask our intelligence services to look more and more on what the Chinese are doing and able to attribute and do something about it on the spot. But this is really becoming more and more of a competition between intelligence services than it is a competition of us being more resilient against the evil hacker world attacking us.
We are almost at the end of time, but I do want to have one last question, because it's dear to my heart, about the education aspect related also to what you just mentioned right now. There are hacking competitions, as you briefly mentioned, like Pwn to Own, for example, where there are real-life targets, such as phones. And looking through the list of companies and individuals participating in these vulnerabilities and reporting these, none of these are European companies or individuals. I might have missed one, but generally speaking, they are out of Asia or the Americas. So I do wonder, how do we bridge this gap in Europe, that apparently there's massive skill lacking in the EU? We don't see participants here. And do you think there's a future? Like, what can we do here in the EU about that?
Well, skills is one of the most most important agenda that we have in the Digital Europe program and in other programs. But the second thing, we've created a market for cybersecurity with this legislation as well. And in a market, demand will grow and universities will see it's interesting. So more and more universities are adapting and are offering computer sciences courses and cybersecurity courses. And I really commend that many youngsters listening and thinking, shall I be studying something with computer sciences? Yes, do it. It's wonderful. It's beautiful to see how these machines operate and to really get the finesse out of it and really understand what is going on. It's rewarding, it's nice, and there's always going to be requirement for your talent. So please do so. And I think in Europe we can make a fist out of this, but we're not the biggest zero-day researchers in the world. They're probably in Beersheba in Israel, and they're probably somewhere in the US and in China. But that doesn't mean that cybersecurity is only about discovering research, doing research on vulnerabilities. It's also about protecting companies, researching adversaries, doing something on the government level with private companies. And what we try to do is make an ecosystem that it all works together. Also with companies, also with other countries. The legal basis is now here in Europe. That's what we created. And there's plenty of work for skilled people.
Thank you very much. I really loved what you said about why people should study computer science. I really hope that we can improve the cybersecurity resilience in Europe. I hope that NIS2 will help for breaches and incidents to be reported and not shamed, but closely followed and analyzed for a data-driven approach to cybersecurity. So thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
And I wish you best of luck with the member states implementing this properly.
You too. Good luck with your good work, Fabian. See you.
Thank you.